My mother charged my teenage sons $500 to let them visit me in the psychiatric hospital where she had illegally committed me using forged documents, and they believed that without the money I would be transferred somewhere even worse. I discovered that my mother was charging my teenage sons $500 every time they wanted to visit me in the psychiatric hospital, where she herself had illegally committed me through falsified medical documents, psychiatric reports forged by corrupt professionals, and systematic judicial manipulation that exploited legal loopholes and the vulnerability of overworked judges who signed commitment orders without adequate case analysis. The discovery of this inadmissible truth happened abruptly and devastatingly, like lightning striking a solitary tree on a plane and splitting it in half, revealing its interior rotted by fungi that no one suspected existed beneath the apparently healthy bark. It was on a specific December afternoon that I will never be able to forget, even if I live 100 years trying to erase it from memory. One of those tropical American afternoons where the heat is not just a thermal sensation, but an oppressive physical presence that transforms the air into an almost solid substance, dense as molasses, that sticks to the skin and makes each breath difficult, forcing the lungs to work twice as hard to extract the necessary oxygen from an atmosphere that seems to have been sucked out by an invisible vacuum pump. The corridor thermometer at the hospital showed an implacable 100 degrees Fahrenheit at 3 in the afternoon, but inside my room without adequate ventilation, with its barred windows that barely allowed a timid breeze to enter, the thermal sensation easily exceeded 104 degrees, transforming that limited space into a suffocating greenhouse where sweat constantly ran down my forehead even without any physical effort. The crumpled brown envelope fell from my son Pedro's trembling hands in a scene that seemed to happen in slow motion, each second stretching like elastic to the breaking point. The yellowed paper from time and humidity descending in an irregular spiral until it hit the hospital linoleum floor worn by decades of intense use, producing a dry and definitive sound that echoed through the small room like a mercy shot that ends an agonizing animal's suffering. It was an ordinary envelope, the kind you buy at any stationery store for pennies, but its contents would reveal crimes so monstrous that they would forever transform my perception of human nature, and especially about the limits, or absence thereof, of the cruelty a mother can inflict on her own daughter when motivated by greed and complete absence of empathy. Pedro, my firstborn who had just turned 18 at a birthday party I couldn't attend because I was locked in that institution, stood before me with his entire body trembling like a green branch, his green eyes identical to mine overflowing with tears he was desperately trying to contain because he had been taught since childhood that men don't cry, but which now flowed freely down his still young face marked by deep dark circles from sleepless nights and constant worry. It was exactly 3:17 in the afternoon, a time that would remain forever engraved in my memory like a temporal scar, the exact and irreversible moment when I discovered that Regina, my 67-year-old mother who had always preached eloquently about unconditional family love, selfless maternal sacrifice, and Christian values of compassion, had transformed my teenage son's desperate suffering into a lucrative and systematic business, religiously charging $500 from each of them monthly to authorize visits to their own hospitalized mother, as if maternal love were a negotiable commodity with a set price. The dry and definitive sound of the paper hitting the worn hospital linoleum floor echoed through the room like a mercy shot, abruptly interrupting our emotional and desperate embrace after 3 endless months without seeing each other. 3 months during which I had believed with growing bitterness that my sons had voluntarily abandoned me by their own choice, out of shame of their crazy mother, not because of systematic and cruel financial extortion orchestrated by their own grandmother who should have protected them. Pedro looked at me with his green eyes identical to mine, now full of contained tears and devastating guilt, his recently turned 18 years seeming to carry the crushing weight of decades of accumulated suffering, while he tried to explain with a voice choked and interrupted by barely disguised sobs, his hands visibly trembling while gesticulating, trying to find adequate words for the inadmissible. "Mom, Grandma repeatedly said she desperately needed the money to pay for your medical expenses here, that the specialized treatment was extremely expensive, and that if we didn't pay religiously, you would be summarily transferred to a terrible and overcrowded public hospital where you wouldn't receive the necessary medical care and could even suffer mistreatment from overworked staff." Gabriel, my 16-year-old younger son, who still maintained childish features on his anguished face, held with white, knuckled fingers a worn school notebook stained with tears, where he had meticulously noted with his adolescent handwriting every extorted payment made to Grandma during the last 6 months of psychological torture, $500 in January when he desperately sold his new video game he had gotten for Christmas. $500 in February after working exhaustively doing food deliveries on bicycle on weekends under scorching sun. $500 in March that he borrowed humiliatingly from school friends making up excuses about family emergencies. The detailed notes in trembling blue pen revealed not only the systematic and relentless financial exploitation of two vulnerable teenagers, but also the growing desperation and psychological anguish of two sons desperately trying to maintain contact with their hospitalized mother while being cruelly exploited financially by their own grandmother, who should have been their safe harbor. My admission to that private psychiatric clinic with a respectable facade but questionable methods had begun precisely 8 months earlier, on a gray April morning when Regina obtained through influential contacts and discreet bribes an emergency court order alleging before a hurried and inattentive judge that I represented imminent danger to myself and others after the traumatic and publicly humiliating divorce from Marcos, which had exposed his multiple betrayals and double life to our entire social community. She had presented to the initial judge, an elderly man near retirement and clearly uninterested in analyzing complex cases, medical documents skillfully falsified by a corrupt psychiatrist she knew through dubious connections, carefully distorted testimonies from elderly neighbors she had manipulated with tearful stories about my supposed progressive mental instability, selected photographs of moments where I appeared beaten down or crying that she had secretly taken during apparently innocent visits, and mainly had cynically exploited the fact that I was temporarily emotionally fragile after discovering through messages on a forgotten cell phone that my husband of 20 years maintained not just one, but 3 simultaneous lovers. An elaborate double life complete with apartments rented under false names, secret bank accounts, and even an unrecognized 7-year-old daughter. What should have been a natural and necessary period of voluntary emotional recovery, with outpatient psychological support, transformed into a Kafkaesque medical prison when Regina assumed through questionable legal maneuvers my complete legal guardianship, unrestricted control of my finances, including bank accounts and investments, decision-making power over my medical treatments, and mainly informal but effective custody of my minor children, who were convinced through systematic psychological manipulation that their mother was too sick to take care of them. During all these hellish months, I had been kept under heavy and unnecessary psychiatric medication that left me perpetually sedated, confused, and unable to articulate complex thoughts, unable to adequately question my situation or seek legal help, while Regina told all acquaintances, distant relatives, and even on social media that she was making a heroic and selfless maternal sacrifice, taking care alone of her mentally ill daughter and grandchildren abandoned by their irresponsible father. The sordid and unthinkable truth began to gradually reveal itself that fateful afternoon when Pedro, already of legal age and legally able to visit me without needing third-party authorization, decided in a desperate act of courage to confront the absurd and cruel rules imposed by Regina, and appeared unexpectedly at the hospital accompanied by Gabriel, who had strategically fled from school during lunch break to finally see his mother after months of forced and anguishing separation. They brought with them not only the crumpled envelope with bank payment receipts, online transfers, and improvised receipts, but also audio recordings on the cell phone with crystal clear quality, where Regina explained her visitation rules with a mercenary and business-like coldness that completely and grotesquely contradicted the image of concerned and sacrificing grandmother she publicly projected to family and acquaintances. You want to see your sick mother? Then you have to contribute financially to the astronomical hospital costs, her recorded voice said with disturbing digital clarity, without any trace of hesitation or remorse. $500 per month each, non-negotiable value, and no exceptions. Grandma also has her own expenses, needs to eat, pay accumulated bills, keep the house running for you. I'm not a bank or charity institution to be supporting everyone with my retirement savings. If you can't or won't pay, you simply don't visit. That's how the real world works. Simple and direct like that. Gabriel's school notebook was a devastating and meticulous document that revealed much more than simple systematic financial extortion. It was a detailed and moving record of the prolonged suffering of two teenagers being systematically exploited, manipulated, and emotionally blackmailed by the grandmother, who should protect and support them in their parents' absence. There were desperate notes about humiliating extra jobs he had gotten to quickly raise money, painful sales of beloved personal belongings with sentimental value, including the autographed guitar he had received from his father on his 15th birthday in happier times, humiliating and embarrassing loans requested from understanding teachers and friends' parents who were shocked by the situation but tried to help discreetly. Each entry in the yellowed notebook was accompanied by emotional observations written with the trembling and irregular handwriting of a desperate and traumatized teenager. Mom seemed thinner today, her facial bones more prominent. I think they drastically increased her medication because she could barely keep her eyes open or speak coherently. Grandma coldly said that if I don't pay next month in full, I can't see Mom anymore until I pay off the accumulated debt. I cried in the school bathroom today thinking that Mom might think we abandoned her. It was an involuntary diary of systematized child psychological torture, disguised as necessary family care. A record of the growing desperation of two boys trying to keep alive the connection with their mother while being exploited by the person who should be their protector. The recordings on Pedro's cell phone were even more revealing and disturbing about Regina's calculating, methodical nature, devoid of genuine empathy. In one of them, dated precisely 3 months ago on a Sunday afternoon that should have been for family rest, she explained with sordid and bureaucratic details her elaborate charging system. Payment has to be made unfailingly always on the first business day of the month, exclusively in cash to avoid unnecessary bank trails. No formal receipt, no stamped proof, no inconvenient questions or questioning. If you're 1 day late, it automatically increases by $100 in cumulative penalty. If you're a full week late, the entire month is summarily blocked for visits, no exceptions or negotiations. And don't cry, make teenage drama, or try to move me with emotional blackmail. Your mother is clinically mentally ill, hospitalized by unquestionable court order, and I'm the only recognized legal guardian. Either you pay exactly the way I'm explaining with crystal clarity, or you'll never see her until you turn 21 and can make legal decisions autonomously. Her voice in the recordings had a metallic quality, cold and completely devoid of any trace of genuine emotion or family affection, making me deeply question whether I really knew the woman who had raised me from birth, rocked me as a baby, taken me to school, supposedly loved me unconditionally. During the next 20 minutes that seemed simultaneously like an eternity and an instant, my sons gradually revealed with broken voices and ashamed looks the complete and grotesque extent of the exploitation scheme Regina had meticulously planned around my forced and illegal commitment. Besides the basic $500 monthly that already represented a fortune for two teenagers, there were abusive extra charges for carefully priced special privileges, an additional $200 for an extra visit in the month when the longing became unbearable, $100 to be able to bring homemade food prepared with love instead of the bland hospital food, $50 for each supervised and timed phone call with military precision lasting a mere 5 minutes. She had transformed with business efficiency access to the hospitalized and vulnerable mother into a lucrative and systematic business that yielded monthly more than many formal salaries, cynically exploiting the emotional desperation of two teenagers traumatized by forced separation from their maternal figure. Pedro worked 40 grueling hours weekly at a mall fast food restaurant, enduring rude customers and the smell of frying impregnated in his clothes, while studying for medical school entrance exams in the early morning hours with red eyes from exhaustion, while Gabriel had abandoned all the extracurricular activities he loved, including soccer and theater, to do degrading informal jobs that paid quickly in cash. From washing cars on the street under scorching sun to carrying supermarket groceries for the elderly. The most shocking and morally repugnant revelation came when Gabriel, with an almost inaudible voice of deep shame and embarrassment, his face red and eyes fixed on the floor, confessed that Regina had proposed a disturbing and Machiavellian discount that revealed the depth of her manipulation. Grandma said quite naturally that if I moved in with her definitely and permanently, abandoning any attempt to contact Dad, and signed some official papers with notarized signatures saying that you were mentally dangerous, violent, and unstable, incapable of caring for minors, she would release visits for free and even allow daily calls. The nefarious proposal was clearly a calculated attempt to obtain legal documentation to indefinitely prolong my forced commitment, maintain perpetual control over my finances and properties, and establish legal grounds for future judicial interdiction, using my own teenage son as a legal tool against me in an unforgivable betrayal of family trust. Gabriel had heroically refused despite the brutal psychological pressure, but the emotional and practical price of refusal had been additional months without being able to see me. Months during which Regina spread to everyone that the ungrateful grandchildren had cruelly abandoned her to live with their irresponsible and womanizing father, meticulously building a narrative of martyrdom sacrificed and misunderstood by the ungrateful family that didn't recognize her sacrifices. Pedro then revealed with evident pride, mixed with nervousness, that he had secretly sought specialized legal help on his own as soon as he turned 18 2 months ago, secretly consulting Dr. Antonio Silva, a renowned lawyer specializing in family law and abuse cases against vulnerable people who was genuinely horrified and outraged upon discovering the sordid details of the case during the initial consultation. Dr. Antonio categorically said that what Grandma is doing constitutes multiple serious crimes, Mom. Qualified extortion of minors, abuse of an incapacitated person, misappropriation of assets, ideological falsity in medical documents, private imprisonment through fraudulent commitment, and a whole endless series of other criminal and civil violations that he methodically listed, Pedro explained, showing on his phone emails exchanged with the lawyer over the last 2 months of careful preparation, correspondence that detailed legal strategies, necessary documentation, and judicial procedures. The lawyer had meticulously instructed the boys to document absolutely everything with almost obsessive rigor. Always record conversations when legally possible. Keep receipts of all transactions, note dates, times, and values with precision. Photograph documents, save messages. Methodically build an irrefutable dossier that could be used judicially to reverse my illegal commitment and hold Regina criminally responsible for the systematic abuses committed. The most emotionally devastating and revealing moment of that afternoon happened when Gabriel showed me with trembling fingers a photo on his phone that he had secretly screenshot. It was a clear image of Regina on a luxury trip to a 5-star resort on the northeast coast, shamelessly posted on social media 2 weeks earlier with the presumptuous caption, "Deserved rest after so much selflessly caring for the ungrateful family." She was languidly reclining in an infinity pool overlooking the turquoise blue sea, holding a colorful and expensive drink decorated with tropical fruits, wearing designer clothes I had never seen before in decades of living together, new jewelry sparkling in the sun, smiling at the camera with an expression of satisfaction and pleasure that contrasted grotesquely and obscenely with the dramatic messages she sent to the boys about sacrificing everything, living on crumbs, giving up her own life to pay for my treatment. The resort trip had easily cost the equivalent of 3 months of accumulated extortions from my sons, documentally proving that the extorted money wasn't being used for medical expenses as she repeatedly claimed, but rather to finance a luxurious and hedonistic lifestyle, built on the emotional and financial suffering of minor grandchildren. Mom, we desperately tried to talk to Dad about this whole absurd situation, beg for help, but he coldly said it wasn't his problem, that you had chosen to commit yourself due to mental weakness, and that Grandma was doing the best she could in a difficult situation that you yourself had created, Gabriel said with evident bitterness and deep hurt in his voice. Marcos, my ex-husband and absent father, had completely washed his hands of the situation like Pilate, cynically taking advantage of my forced absence to rebuild his life with the main lover he had kept hidden during years of marriage, a woman 20 years younger who now lived in the house we had built together. He paid the minimum court-ordered alimony directly to Regina through automatic bank transfer, who claimed to be using the money for the boys' basic needs, including food and education, but who was actually accumulating everything in a separate investment account, while forcing the teenage sons themselves to work degradingly to get money for food, transportation, and basic school needs. His deliberate and cruel negligence had created the perfect and conducive environment for Regina to exercise her abusive control and financial exploitation, without external interference or inconvenient questioning. It was at this crucial moment of devastating revelations and inadmissible truths that the head nurse, a robust, middle-aged woman with an authoritarian air, abruptly entered the room to inform with a bureaucratic voice that the regulated visiting hours had ended 5 minutes ago, and that they needed to leave immediately. But Pedro immediately showed her with determination an official document he had strategically brought, an emergency court injunction printed on letterhead that Dr. Antonio had obtained that same morning after an urgent petition, authorizing unrestricted and unsupervised visits, temporarily suspending Regina's power over visitations, and mainly initiating a complete judicial investigation into the suspicious circumstances of my commitment. The nurse, an experienced woman with gray hair who had clearly witnessed decades of complicated family situations and abuse disguised as care, read the document with professional attention, her eyes progressively widening as she absorbed the legal implications, and then looked at me with an expression of professional understanding mixed with genuine human compassion. Mrs. Laura, it seems your brave sons have obtained substantial legal help. I'll call the medical director immediately because this completely and fundamentally changes your legal situation here at the institution. The medical director, Dr. Carlos Mendonça, a tall and imposing 60-year-old man with a professorial bearing, arrived 20 minutes later, hastily accompanied by the hospital's complete legal team, including 2 lawyers and the general administrator, all visibly concerned and alarmed by the potentially devastating legal implications of what was being revealed. When Pedro methodically presented the recordings of Regina explicitly admitting to charging exorbitant amounts to authorize visits, showed the bank transfer receipts religiously made by the boys to Grandma, displayed the notebook with Gabriel's detailed notes documenting months of extortion, and mainly when he revealed the bribery proposals for false testimonies, the atmosphere in the room changed drastically from bureaucratic skepticism to genuine institutional alarm. "This is extremely serious and potentially criminal," said the director, already picking up the phone to urgently call the hospital's legal department with visibly agitated hands. If the legal guardian was charging fees to authorize visits, extorting minors, this completely and retroactively invalidates the legitimacy of the guardianship and calls into question all procedures of this commitment. We need to immediately and thoroughly review the entire admission process, all documentation presented, all medical reports. It was evident from the growing pallor on their faces that the hospital was realizing with growing horror that it had been used as an involuntary tool in an elaborate scheme of family exploitation, kidnapping through fraud, and continued extortion. During the following hour, while doctors and lawyers frantically ran through the corridors to assess the situation, review medical records, and consult superiors, my sons told me with painful details more about the months of psychological manipulation and systematic emotional abuse they had suffered at Regina's calculating hands. She had obsessively installed security cameras in every room of the house, including bedrooms, to continuously monitor all their movements, remotely controlled cell phones through sophisticated spy apps that recorded every keystroke, compulsively read all messages, emails, and social media conversations, tracked GPS location in real time, and mainly had created an elaborate network of informants among gossiping neighbors, domestic workers, and acquaintances who religiously reported any attempt by the boys to seek outside help or question the arrangement. She constantly said that if we told anyone about the payments, about the rules, you would be immediately transferred to a terrible public hospital where you would be mistreated, sexually abused, could contract diseases, and even die abandoned. Gabriel revealed with a trembling voice, showing threatening text messages that Regina had obsessively sent whenever she paranoidly suspected they were questioning the arrangement or seeking outside help. The psychological manipulation had been so intense, systematic, and prolonged that both boys had developed severe symptoms of generalized anxiety, clinical depression, and post-traumatic stress during the months of forced separation and continued extortion. Pedro had lost 33 pounds in 3 months, his bones now visible under pale skin, was taking controlled medication for chronic insomnia that the family doctor had prescribed without knowing the real cause, had developed a gastric ulcer due to constant stress, while Gabriel had started having incapacitating panic attacks at school that had taken him to the infirmary by ambulance several times, uncontrollable crying crises during classes, and intrusive thoughts about death and abandonment. "We sincerely thought it was our fault, Mom, that we weren't trying hard enough to get the money, that we were bad, ungrateful, and incompetent children for not being able to pay to see our own mother," Pedro said through tears he could no longer contain, revealing the depth of psychological damage caused by Regina's systematic and cruel manipulation. They had completely internalized guilt and financial responsibility in a way no teenager should experience, transformed into premature adults by the need for emotional survival. Dr. Antonio Silva arrived at the hospital exactly 2 hours after the initial revelation, bringing with him a voluminous brown leather folder containing meticulously organized legal documents he had prepared in advance, anticipating this crucial moment. He was an imposing 48-year-old man with impeccable professional posture that commanded immediate respect, prematurely gray hair that conferred natural authority, perfectly cut gray suit, and mainly an expression of unwavering determination that suggested decades of experience dealing with complex cases of family abuse and human rights violations. "Mrs. Laura, your brave son sought me out 2 months ago in absolute desperation, and since then I've been meticulously building a solid and irrefutable case against your mother. What she did constitutes multiple serious crimes with aggravating factors, and we have more than sufficient documentary evidence to not only immediately reverse your illegal commitment, but also hold her criminally responsible with severe penalties," he explained with a professional but compassionate voice, already chronologically organizing documents on the improvised table in the hospital room. each paper a piece of the legal puzzle that would prove the crimes committed. The lawyer had discovered through detailed and meticulous investigation that Regina had deliberately falsified medical documents to obtain my initial commitment, paying through intermediaries a corrupt doctor known in the criminal underworld for selling psychiatric reports to sign papers stating serious mental conditions without ever having adequately examined me or even met me personally. She had used my temporarily fragile emotional state after the traumatic divorce as a convenient pretext, grotesquely exaggerating normal and expected symptoms of situational depression and grief to appear as severe psychosis, hallucinations, and suicidal tendencies that required immediate hospitalization and chemical restraint. Your mother methodically planned this for months with surgical precision, Mrs. Laura. We found digital evidence that she obsessively researched guardianship, interdiction, involuntary commitment, and asset control long before you showed any sign of emotional fragility, revealed the lawyer with professional indignation, showing printouts of Regina's computer browsing history that had been seized by court order, hundreds of pages of searches about how to commit a family member, guardianship of an adult, control of an incapacitated person's assets. The revelation that my own mother had coldly premeditated my forced commitment to assume control of my assets and financially exploit my children was too devastating to fully process at that moment, a betrayal so deep it seemed physically painful. During our 20-year marriage, Marcos and I had accumulated considerable wealth, including 2 valued properties in upscale neighborhoods, diversified investments in stocks and funds, substantial savings specifically for the boys' college education, plus family jewelry and artwork. With the contentious divorce, half of these assets had come under my exclusive control, and Regina had seen a gleaming golden opportunity when she saw me temporarily vulnerable and without support from my ex-husband. She systematically transferred money from your accounts to her own and shell accounts, claiming to be paying urgent medical expenses that were actually completely fictitious or extremely inflated by up to 500% of the real value, explained Dr. Antonio with forensic precision, showing highlighted bank statements documenting months of systematic fraudulent transactions, transfers to offshore accounts, untraceable cash withdrawals. The most disturbing and psychologically devastating aspect was discovering that Regina had maintained an elaborate double life during this entire period of exploitation. While for family, acquaintances, and on social media, she expertly played the role of sacrificing and suffering mother, selflessly caring for her mentally ill daughter and grandchildren cruelly abandoned by their father. Secretly, she was living a life of ostentatious luxury, financed by my money and the systematic extortion of my traumatized teenage sons. Pedro had discovered through his own digital investigation fake social media profiles where she presented herself as a successful retired businesswoman and wealthy widow, attending exclusive and expensive events at private clubs, taking international trips to exotic destinations in first class, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, and mainly building a completely fictitious and fantastical narrative about her life where neither I nor my children existed, as if we were disposable characters. It was like discovering that the person who had raised me from the cradle was a complete stranger with frightening and sociopathic capacity for pretense, manipulation, and calculated cruelty. The hospital medical team, confronted with the irrefutable evidence presented by Dr. Antonio and the court injunction, immediately initiated the emergency process of complete reassessment of my case. Dr. Patricia Almeida, the institution's chief psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, personally conducted an exhaustive evaluation that lasted 3 uninterrupted hours and included page review of my entire medical record since admission, detailed interviews about my personal and family history, standardized psychological tests, neurological exams to verify damage from excessive medication, and mainly critical and forensic analysis of the fraudulent documents that had justified my initial commitment. Mrs. Laura, after thorough and careful analysis, it is absolutely evident that you never presented symptoms that would justify involuntary commitment or antipsychotic medication. You were going through a completely normal and expected process of grief and adjustment after a difficult and traumatic divorce, something that could have been perfectly treated with weekly outpatient therapy and perhaps mild antidepressants. She concluded with evident professional indignation, already preparing the detailed medical report that would be fundamental to judicially reverse my situation and prosecute those responsible for the fraudulent commitment. During the following days, while the legal procedures for my release were urgently processed by the justice system, more sordid and grotesque details about Regina's Machiavellian scheme began to emerge like an iceberg revealing its submerged mass. Gabriel had kept a detailed digital diary on his password-protected phone, where he obsessively recorded not only the extorted payments and threats made, but also the specific psychological manipulation techniques that Grandma used with surgical precision. There were painful entries about how she calculatingly alternated between emotional extremes, being extremely affectionate and maternal when they paid on time, preparing their favorite foods and watching movies together, then transforming into a cruelly cold and distant figure when they questioned any aspect of the arrangement, locking the pantry, cutting off internet, confiscating belongings. Grandma repeatedly said that Mom got worse and more agitated when we visited a lot, that our visits made her emotionally unstable and disrupted the delicate treatment, but that she allowed it anyway because she loved us too much to completely deprive us. Gabriel had written in a particularly painful entry dated 2 months ago, revealing how Regina used fabricated false medical concerns to justify the cruel access restrictions and maintain control through artificial scarcity of maternal contact. Pedro had done something even braver, riskier, and socially impactful. He had secretly created an online support group on Telegram for other young people in similar situations of family exploitation, and had discovered with horror that cases of grandparents, uncles, or other relatives financially exploiting access to hospitalized, imprisoned, or institutionalized parents was drastically more common than anyone imagined or authorities recognized. There's a 15-year-old girl in the group whose grandmother charges $300 per 15-minute visit to her father, who's been in a coma for 2 years, another 17-year-old guy whose uncle charges monthly to take him and his younger siblings to see their mother in drug rehab, a 13-year-old girl who has to work as a babysitter to pay her aunt, who controls visits to her father with Alzheimer's. Pedro told me with a choked voice, showing group conversations that revealed a disturbing and systematic pattern of institutionalized family exploitation. The group had become not only a vital network of emotional support among traumatized youth, but also a collaborative source of legal information, resistance strategies, and documentation to combat these widespread abuses. The emergency judicial hearing was strategically scheduled for a rainy and gray Monday, 5 days after the initial revelation at the hospital at the city's central courthouse. Dr. Helena Martins, the judge responsible for the case, was an imposing 53-year-old Black woman with a formidable reputation for being particularly severe and relentless, with cases of abuse against minors and vulnerable people, having written academic articles on intrafamily exploitation. When she entered the courtroom with her impeccable robe and serious expression, and saw the impressive amount of evidence that Dr. Antonio had meticulously prepared, boxes of transcribed recordings, highlighted bank transfers, printed digital diaries, sworn medical testimonies, reviewed and rectified psychiatric reports, her expression became progressively more severe and outraged. This is one of the most serious, cruel, and systematic cases of family abuse and financial exploitation of minors I have seen in 20 years of magistracy, she declared after preliminarily reviewing the documents for 40 minutes of tense silence in the room, her eyes quickly scanning pages of evidence while everyone anxiously waited. Regina appeared at the hearing escorted by court officers and accompanied by a public defender, clearly uncomfortable and unprepared to defend such a compromising case, desperately trying to maintain an appearance of a concerned, elderly grandmother misunderstood by the new generations. She had strategically dressed deliberately modestly, with a simple and old-fashioned black dress, without any of the expensive jewelry or designer clothes she had bought with money extorted from her grandchildren, her gray hair purposely disheveled, trying to project a calculated image of a fragile, humble, and well-intentioned elderly lady who had been misinterpreted. But when the judge began to loudly play the audio recordings where she coldly and emotionlessly explained her elaborate charging scheme, the carefully constructed mask began to progressively crack and fall. "You are saying in this recording, and I quote verbatim, 'Grandma needs to eat too, needs to pay bills,' while charging $500 monthly from each minor grandchild to authorize supervised visits to their hospitalized mother. Can you explain how a retiree claiming financial difficulties was in the same period taking luxury international trips?" asked the magistrate, with a cutting voice that echoed through the silent room. Regina initially tried to deny with theatrical indignation, then minimize with elaborate excuses about misunderstandings, inflation, and medical costs, and finally justify her actions with an elaborate and tearful narrative about sacrifices of an elderly mother and exorbitant hospital costs. "Your Honor, caring for a daughter with serious mental problems and 2 rebellious teenage grandchildren is extremely expensive and exhausting. I was only asking for a symbolic and fair contribution to help with expenses that consumed my retirement, she said with a voice trained to sound fragile and victimized, even trembling strategically. But when the judge methodically presented evidence of luxury trips with photos at five-star resorts, expensive purchases at designer stores with receipts, fraudulent million-dollar transfers from my accounts with bank statements, the defense collapsed spectacularly and completely. Mrs. Regina Silva Santos, the evidence demonstrates unequivocally and beyond any reasonable doubt that you not only systematically extorted minors in situations of extreme vulnerability, but also committed qualified misappropriation, falsification of public documents, criminal conspiracy with the corrupt doctor, and continued abuse of a vulnerable person, declared the judge, her severe voice echoing through the room while Regina visibly paled. The most dramatic and emotionally charged moment of the hearing happened when Gabriel was called to testify as a witness. At 16, wearing his wrinkled school uniform, visibly trembling with nervousness, he described through tears he couldn't contain the months of psychological anguish. The humiliations of having to beg for borrowed money from strangers making up excuses, the desperation of selling beloved objects with sentimental value to raise the $500 monthly, the sleepless nights wondering if Mom thought she had been abandoned. Grandma constantly said that if we didn't pay on time, Mom would be transferred to a horrible place, a warehouse for crazy people where she would be tied up, sedated to unconsciousness, and mistreated. She purposely showed sensationalist news about public hospitals where patients suffered terrible abuses and coldly said it would be entirely our fault if something happened to Mom, he testified with a broken voice, needing to stop several times to regain his composure. The judge had to interrupt the testimony 3 times to give him time to recover, offering water and tissues, and it was visible that even the court officials and stenographer were visibly emotional and outraged by the detailed account of prolonged suffering. Pedro was even more direct, articulate, and devastating in his prepared testimony. Already of legal age and with evidence meticulously organized in a digital presentation on his tablet, he presented a detailed and illustrated timeline of the extortion scheme with graphs and spreadsheets, showing how Regina had gradually and calculatingly escalated the charges as she perceived the grandchildren's growing desperation and tested the limits of exploitation. It started with $200 supposedly for snacks during visits, then went up to $300 claiming increased parking, $400 with the excuse of gas, until reaching the fixed $500 monthly plus extra fees. Whenever we tried to negotiate, question, or delay, she coldly threatened to completely cut off visits and said Mom would be alone and abandoned because of our fault, he explained with a firm but emotional voice, showing printed text messages where Regina made explicit threats, emotional blackmail, and cruel ultimatums. The judge examined each piece of evidence with meticulous attention, making extensive notes and occasionally shaking her head in disbelief and repulsion at the systematic cruelty and emotional coldness revealed in the documents. My testimony was the longest, most exhaustive, and emotionally draining, lasting almost 2 uninterrupted hours. I described in painful detail how I had been kept under excessive and unnecessary antipsychotic medication that prevented me from thinking clearly or questioning my situation, how the rare times I tried to contest the commitment or reduce medication, I was immediately described in the medical records as agitated, resistant to treatment, presenting worsening of the delusional condition, resulting in more medication and even physical restraint. I explained how Regina had cynically exploited my vulnerable state after discovering through cell phone messages Marcos's multiple betrayals with sordid details, using my temporary fragility to gradually convince me that I really needed intensive psychiatric help and hospitalization, manipulating my Catholic mother's guilt about being a burden to my children and my fears about the traumatic impact of divorce on the boys. She repeatedly said it would be better and healthier for them to see me less while I recovered from the trauma, that my crying crises could permanently traumatize them and affect their development. I believed blindly because I was emotionally destroyed, and because never, in 4 decades of life, could I have imagined that my own mother would be capable of such calculated cruelty and systematic exploitation. I testified through tears I didn't try to contain, needing to stop several times to take deep breaths and control the physical nausea the memories caused. The judge's sentence was pronounced after 2 hours of careful deliberation, time during which Regina remained in sepulchral and stony silence, finally understanding the irreversible gravity of the consequences of her criminal acts. This court determines with immediate effect. First, the complete and retroactive revocation of any guardianship or curatorship of Mrs. Regina over Laura Santos. Second, the immediate and unconditional release of Laura Santos from psychiatric hospitalization, with a formal apology from the institution. Third, the full return with monetary correction of all amounts inappropriately appropriated from both Laura and extorted from minors Pedro and Gabriel, to be executed through judicial seizure of assets if necessary. And mainly, this court refers the case entirely to the criminal sphere for prosecution for continued qualified extortion against minors, aggravated misappropriation, falsification of public documents, criminal conspiracy, and systematic abuse of minors and a vulnerable person, declared Dr. Helena Martins with a firm and solemn voice that left no room for appeals or questioning. Each word a definitive sentence. The judge went beyond the basic and protocol determinations, also establishing a permanent restraining order, preventing Regina from approaching within 500 feet of me or my children under penalty of immediate arrest, determining criminal investigation of all medical professionals who had participated directly or indirectly in the fraudulent commitment, including the corrupt psychiatrist, and mainly ordering mandatory, state-subsidized psychological counseling for Pedro and Gabriel for at least 2 years to help them process the deep trauma of the experience. This court rarely sees cases where family abuse reaches such calculated, systematic levels devoid of basic human empathy. The financial exploitation of minors using desperate love for their mother as an extortion weapon is particularly repugnant and inadmissible in a civilized society, said the magistrate, looking directly at Regina, who kept her gaze fixed on the floor. Finally, without words or excuses. When we left the courthouse that afternoon that had started rainy but now showed a timid sun between the clouds, the feeling was one of deep relief mixed with an existential sadness for the loss not of the mother Regina had been at some distant point, but of the comforting illusion that she had ever been a real mother. Pedro and Gabriel hugged me at length on the marble courthouse steps, the three of us crying copiously together for the first time in months, not tears of sadness but of cathartic liberation from a nightmare that had seemed endless and inescapable. "We'll never let anyone separate us again, Mom. Never again," Gabriel said with new and mature determination in his voice, and Pedro silently agreed, the three forming a stronger, more united and more conscious family unit for having survived together such an ordeal and betrayal. In the months following the liberating judicial decision, the process of rebuilding our lives was simultaneously painful, like cauterizing wounds, and liberating like being reborn from ashes. We strategically moved to a new house in a completely different neighborhood, far from any toxic memories associated with Regina or the traumatic period of commitment and exploitation. I began intensive therapy 3 times a week with a psychologist specializing in complex family trauma and family Stockholm syndrome, working hard to process not only the months of forced commitment and chemical sedation, but also a lifetime of subtle manipulations. Emotional blackmail disguised as maternal love, and controls that I now clearly recognized had always existed in different intensities. Pedro and Gabriel also began individual therapy specialized in adolescent trauma and family therapy, where we learned to trust each other again, to express repressed emotions, and to rebuild healthy bonds without fear of exploitation. The criminal investigation against Regina progressively revealed that the scheme was even broader, more sophisticated, and premeditated than we had initially discovered. She had created falsified documents presenting me as permanently and irreversibly mentally incapacitated, was in an advanced process of selling one of my properties through forged powers of attorney, claiming urgent need for resources for specialized medical treatment abroad, and mainly had begun planting legal seeds to later judicially question Marcos's paternity of the boys through forged DNA, creating a bizarre narrative where she would be the only capable and adequate legal guardian. Detailed drafts of documents were found on her computer where she Machiavellianly planned to expand the exploitation scheme, including monthly charges for the boys to live in the house that was mine, rental systems for their own rooms, and even a dystopian system of tuition to have access to their own belongings and food. Regina's criminal trial took place 8 months after the initial hearing, in a process that gained local media attention due to its unusual and cruel aspect. During this period of probation, she repeatedly tried contact through manipulated third parties, sending dramatic messages about being sorry, about being an elderly and sick lady who had made mistakes out of financial desperation after being abandoned by family, about deserving Christian forgiveness and a second chance. But the evidence presented at the criminal trial painted a very different and more sinister picture, that of a woman who had coldly calculated every aspect of her scheme with psychopathic precision, who had specifically researched psychological manipulation and brainwashing techniques, who had studied similar cases to perfect her method, and who had shown zero genuine remorse during months of investigation, only strategic regret for having been discovered and frustration for having her lucrative scheme interrupted. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison in a closed regime for continued qualified extortion against minors, plus 2 years for misappropriation and falsification of public documents, totaling 6 years of imprisonment without the right to progression of regime in the first 3 years. An unexpected but deeply significant and transformative development was the exponential growth of the online support group Pedro had created. What began as a small forum of young people sharing similar traumatic experiences grew into a nationally recognized formal non-profit organization offering free legal support, psychological support, and educational resources for families victims of extortion for access to hospitalized, imprisoned, or institutionalized relatives. Pedro, now 19 and studying law at a federal university with a full scholarship, motivated and inspired by the traumatic experience, became a vocal and respected activist for the rights of minors in situations of extreme family vulnerability. If our story of suffering and overcoming can prevent a single family from going through the hell we went through, then something positive and transformative will have emerged from this nightmare, he said at a recent lecture at the National Congress about intrafamily financial abuse and the need for specific legislation. Gabriel, in turn, channeled his traumatic experience into art with extraordinary talent, writing and illustrating a touching and visually impactful graphic novel about a teenager desperately fighting to maintain contact with his hospitalized mother while facing a villain who controls access through increasingly absurd and cruel charges. A clear but artistically elaborate metaphor for our experience. The work, independently published through crowdfunding that raised triple its goal, went viral on social media, was translated into 5 languages, and is being adapted for an animated series by a major studio that promises to bring awareness about family abuse to a global young audience. I want other teenagers around the world to viscerally know that it's not normal, it's not acceptable, and mainly it's not their fault if adults in positions of power and trust exploit them emotionally or financially, Gabriel explained in an emotional interview about the project that was seen by millions. Professionally, I resumed with renewed vigor my career as an interior designer that had been brutally interrupted by the traumatic divorce and subsequent forced commitment. With the assets fully recovered through legal actions and the substantial compensation ordered by the court for moral and material damages, I opened my own studio specializing in creating therapeutic and welcoming spaces for people recovering from various traumas. Each project is simultaneously a way to process my own traumatic experience and an opportunity to create environments that promote genuine healing, emotional safety, and personal autonomy. Many of my clients are people who have gone through similar situations of family, institutional abuse, or systematic exploitation, and we find mutual strength and deep understanding in transforming physical spaces as a powerful metaphor for transforming shattered lives. The relationship with Marcos remained strictly formal, cold, and limited exclusively to practical matters about the boys through lawyers. He never genuinely apologized for his cowardly omission during the period of abuse, never acknowledged how his deliberate negligence had created the conditions conducive to Regina exercising her cruel control and systematic exploitation. The boys maintained minimal and protocol contact with him, resentful not only for the abandonment during the most serious family crisis, but also for the subsequent revelation through the investigation that he partially knew about the charging scheme through comments from acquaintances, but had conveniently chosen to ignore because it wasn't his problem, and because it suited him to have the children busy and away while building a new life. This attitude revealed a fundamental and unforgivable indifference to his own children's well-being that permanently destroyed any possibility of future genuine relationship. A particularly painful but necessary and therapeutic aspect of the recovery process was accepting through months of intensive therapy that I had been a victim not of an isolated event of betrayal, but of decades of subtle and systematic manipulation. With the help of the specialized therapist, I identified disturbing patterns of Regina's behavior dating back to my earliest childhood. The constant use of guilt as a control tool. After everything I've done for you. The implicit monetization of affection and care. You owe me this. The deliberate creation of emotional dependence through constant criticism disguised as maternal concern. It's for your own good. Your mother psychologically prepared you throughout your life to accept forced commitment as something you deserved, planting seeds of doubt about your own sanity, ability, and worth as a person, my therapist explained in a revealing session, helping me understand the depth of manipulation suffered and why it had been so difficult to initially believe she would be capable of such cruelty. Today, 3 years after that revealing afternoon at the hospital that changed everything, our rebuilt family is infinitely stronger than it ever was. Pedro is in his 3rd year of law school, interning at Dr. Antonio Silva's office and specializing in family rights and protection of vulnerable people, having already helped dozens of families in similar situations. Gabriel, now 19, studies graphic design at a prestigious university with a full scholarship for artistic merit, and continues developing projects that transform trauma into art and social awareness. I expanded my studio, which now employs 5 people, including 2 women who were victims of domestic violence, creating not only transformative physical spaces, but also a community of healing, mutual support, and rebirth. Regina serves her sentence in a state women's penitentiary, having lost all appeals. I received exactly 3 letters from her in the first months, full of self-victimization, emotional manipulation, and attempts to arouse guilt. But following therapeutic guidance, I returned them all unopened. The decision to completely and definitively cut contact was painful but absolutely necessary for my mental health and that of my children. Family, I learned painfully, is not defined by accidental blood ties, but by people who protect, support, and love us unconditionally, without charging, literally or figuratively, for that love. The notebook where Gabriel had noted all the payments is preserved in a safe, not as a morbid reminder, but as a symbol of survival and concrete proof that documenting abuse, however painful it may be at the moment, can be the key to liberation and justice. Occasionally, when I doubt my decision to definitively cut contact with Regina, I look at those notes with my desperate teenage son's trembling handwriting and viscerally remember why some bridges need to be burned completely and definitively to protect those we truly love. The phrase, "Grandma needs to eat too," became a dark but powerful code between us, a constant reminder of how basic needs can be weaponized, how family love can be perversely monetized, and mainly how constant vigilance against manipulation is necessary even, or especially, with those who should protect us unconditionally. But it also paradoxically became a symbol of our unwavering resistance, our refusal to accept exploitation disguised as care, our fierce determination to protect each other against anyone who tries to turn love into currency. Our weekly Sunday dinner, a sacred tradition we established immediately after liberation, is inviolable. No charges, no conditions, no manipulations, just a mother and 2 sons who survived the unthinkable and consciously chose to rebuild with solid foundations of genuine mutual trust and true unconditional love. Pedro always cooks elaborate dishes he learned from online tutorials. Gabriel always brings creative dessert he prepares himself, and I always set the table with special care using the new china we bought together, creating a ritual of connection and healing that no money in the world could buy. During these sacred dinners, we often share memories of the traumatic period, not to masochistically relive the pain, but to remember and celebrate how much we've grown and strengthened since then. Grandma needs to eat too. 5 words that revealed a moral rot so deep it destroyed 3 generations of a family. But also 5 words that catalyzed our definitive liberation, our conscious reconstruction, our rebirth as a chosen family conquered with blood and tears, not imposed by blood. Regina may have charged $500 a month for the privilege of keeping our family united, but we definitively discovered that true love has no price, and those who try to price it reveal they never knew its real invaluable worth. The last encounter with Regina happened 5 years after her conviction, on a frigid July morning when I was notified by the prison about her terminal health condition. Pancreatic cancer had advanced mercilessly, and doctors estimated weeks to live. The official notification arrived in a brown envelope identical to the one that had revealed the extortion years earlier. The irony didn't go unnoticed. Pedro and Gabriel, now graduated and professionally established adults, sat with me on the porch of our new house to decide together, as a family, if there was anything to be done. "She's alone, Mom. Nobody visits her," Gabriel said softly, his green eyes carrying compassion even after all the suffering inflicted. Pedro remained silent, processing the moral complexity of the situation with the sharp legal mind he had developed. We talked for hours about forgiveness, justice, humanity, and the limits of compassion. There were no easy answers, only the certainty that any decision made would be for us, not for her. I visited Regina once, alone, on an afternoon of dense fog that transformed the world into indistinct shapes. The prison hospital was a place of concentrated despair, where wasted lives awaited the end in medical cells. She was unrecognizable, her body consumed by disease, her once calculating eyes now opaque and distant, her hair completely white and thin. There were no dramatic requests for forgiveness, no attempts at final manipulation, just heavy silence between us. Decades of dysfunctional relationship condensed into minutes of hospital quietude. "The boys are well," was all I said before leaving. She closed her eyes and nodded slightly, a minimal gesture that could mean anything or nothing. Regina passed away 3 days later, at 4 in the morning, alone except for the nurse on duty. She took with her the deep reasons for her cruelty, the unprocessed traumas that transformed her into a predator of her own descendants, the secrets that shaped her inability to love without charging. The funeral was minimalist, paid for by the state, on a morning with gray skies that threatened rain but never delivered on the promise. We attended briefly, not for her, but for ourselves, to definitively close that dark chapter. We were the only ones present besides the young priest who murmured generic prayers for a life he didn't know. Gabriel left on the simple coffin a drawing he had made at 7 years old, where she appeared smiling beside him in a park they used to visit before everything collapsed. "To remember there were moments before the darkness," he explained with a choked voice, recognizing the complexity of loving and hating the same person. Pedro read an excerpt about justice and redemption from a book he had studied in college, words about how even the most lost souls deserve some form of dignified farewell. I remained silent, watching the damp earth cover not just a body, but an entire era of generational manipulation, literally burying decades of accumulated pain. We discovered in the estate that Regina had meticulously kept all our childhood photos in albums organized by year. Letters I had written as a teenager with naive and hopeful handwriting, grandchildren's drawings from the first scribbles to more elaborate works. In a folder marked family with trembling handwriting, we also found an old diary, yellowed pages where she described in painful detail her own father, charging her to visit her at boarding school as a child, demanding that she work in the school kitchen to deserve the right to see him on Sundays, revealing a vicious cycle of effective monetization that crossed generations like a hereditary curse. There were entries about her mother, my grandmother I never met, who charged hugs with household chores, who conditioned dinner on perfect behavior, who transformed basic needs into control currency. The revelation didn't justify her crimes, but contextualized the deep family pathology that we had finally managed to definitively interrupt. "The cycle ends with us," Pedro declared solemnly while we burned the toxic documents in the backyard, the flames consuming generations of documented pain, preserving only the genuine memories of our reconstruction, and some photos from our childhood before the darkness set in. The healing process continued for years after her death. I discovered in therapy layers of trauma I didn't even suspect existed. Suppressed memories of Regina charging for affection with good behavior when I was 5 years old, of having to deserve birthday presents with perfect grades, of love always conditioned on performance. Gabriel revealed in his own therapy that he had attempted suicide at 15, at the height of desperation during the extortion, something he had hidden from everyone out of shame and fear. Pedro confessed he had developed obsessive-compulsive disorder related to money, obsessively counting every penny, unable to spend without extreme guilt, needing years of treatment to establish a healthy relationship with finances. Each revelation was simultaneously devastating and liberating, exposing the depth of damage caused, but also our extraordinary resilience in surviving and transcending. Today, 10 years after that revealing afternoon at the psychiatric hospital, our story has become a case study at psychology, law, and social work universities across the country. Pedro is a prosecutor specializing in crimes against vulnerable people, having helped create specific legislation against effective extortion that has already protected hundreds of families. He married Marina, a pediatrician he met during a lecture on child protection, and together they created a foundation that offers free legal assistance to victims of family abuse. Gabriel became an internationally renowned art therapist, developing innovative techniques for working with young people traumatized by family abuse. His graphic novel was adapted for a television series that won important awards and raised awareness among millions about the reality of abuse disguised as care. He married Thomas, a sensitive musician who composed a symphony about family resilience inspired by our story. I expanded my work to include consulting at psychiatric institutions in 5 states, helping identify signs of fraudulent commitment and systematic abuse, having been instrumental in freeing dozens of people in situations similar to mine. Sunday dinners remain sacred and inviolable, now expanded to include the families Pedro and Gabriel consciously built. The table that once accommodated 3 traumatized survivors now overflows with genuine laughter, unfiltered conversations, unconditional love flowing freely. My grandchildren, 7-year-old Sophia, 5-year-old twins Lucas and Miguel, and 2-year-old little Helena, grow up in an environment where love never has a price, where affection flows naturally without charges, where family bonds are celebrated, not monetized. I watch with deep emotion as Pedro teaches Sophia about healthy boundaries when she tries to negotiate kisses for extra dessert, patiently explaining that love is not negotiated. I see Gabriel showing the twins that expressing emotions is fundamental strength, not weakness, when they cry frustrated and are welcomed without judgment. With each generation, we progressively heal ancestral wounds, definitively proving that trauma doesn't need to be an inexorable destiny transmitted as a cursed inheritance. I created a project called Love Without Price that has already reached schools across the country, teaching children to identify when affection is being used as manipulation currency. The program includes interactive theater, age-appropriate discussions, and mainly validates children's feelings who instinctively know when something is wrong, but don't have the vocabulary to express it. I receive emotional letters weekly from parents who discovered through their children that they were inadvertently perpetuating inherited toxic patterns, beginning their own healing journeys. One mother wrote, "My 8-year-old daughter told me that at Love Without Price, she learned that hugs can't be bought with good behavior. I cried for hours realizing what I was doing without knowing. I keep framed on my office wall a single sentence I wrote during the most difficult therapy. Love that charges is not love. It's emotional commerce disguised as affection." It became my professional and personal mantra, reminding me daily that we survive the unthinkable not despite true love, but because of it. Those $500 monthly that Regina charged definitively revealed that she never understood the one fundamental truth about family. The strongest bonds are precisely those that exist without guarantees, without contracts, without charges. Sustained only by the daily and conscious choice to remain connected despite the imperfections, frustrations, and natural challenges of authentic human relationships. Gabriel's yellowed notebook, preserved as a memorial in a time-proof frame, now has a last entry written by him at 25 with firm adult handwriting. "Today my son spontaneously hugged me and said he loves me. It cost nothing. It was worth everything. The cycle is definitively broken. This is how we definitively win, not by forgetting the traumatic past, but by consciously refusing to perpetuate it, actively choosing to write a future where love flows free and abundant as it should have always been, where the next generations will only know stories about the old time when love had a price." As a cautionary tale about what must never be repeated, our story began with the devastating and inadmissible discovery that love was being sold for $500 monthly in a grotesque transaction that violated everything family should mean. It ends with the unshakable certainty that true love is, by ontological definition, priceless and immeasurable. Regina died without understanding this fundamental distinction, taking to the grave a life wasted on effective transactions. We live celebrating this truth daily, transforming scars into shared wisdom, trauma into active compassion, survival into greater purpose. Every Sunday, when our expanded family gathers around the table without charges or conditions, when love flows naturally between healed and healing generations, Regina is involuntarily remembered and consciously forgiven, not for her, but for us, so we can live fully free from the weight of her toxic legacy, writing with our lives the definitive proof that true love not only has no price, it is the only wealth that matters. Did you like Laura's story? So subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment on where you are watching. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there that I wait for you.